Okay, so this is the section of Chapter 12 on social emotional development in middle childhood, where we focus on the information that is included in assignment number 3. So in elementary school and middle childhood, there's a greater awareness of emotional display rules, or what society expects them to do in relationship to their emotions. Their ability to identify and label emotions improves, and emotional regulation is the key to successful social interactions, so even their peers expect them to regulate their behavior better. Older children need less support from adults to regulate their emotions than younger children do. And emotional competence is related to social competence. And interventions can help. And so adults need to support children where they see that need is there. And so here you have a chart that reflects some of the issues with emotional regulation. So you can see there is a primary appraisal of the emotion they're feeling that happens in the heat of the moment, and then their ability to regulate that. And then in order to do that, they have to regulate their point of view in regards to that, and think about the cognitive and societal constraints, and then that regulates their behavior. And then the secondary appraisal, this is where they think about it, so they're better able to cope emotionally, cognitively, and behaviorally. Okay, so part of that social regulation is moral reasoning, or what is right and wrong. And so in elementary school and middle childhood, they're developing that ability to understand and implement moral principles in their daily conduct. And Piaget, our cognitive theorist, proposed that children are rigid early on in their moral reasoning, and then later they become more flexible, and we'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. But he says that children believe rules are determined by a supreme authority at the beginning. So even though that there's nobody there, they still might think they'll get in trouble for doing inappropriate things. Kohlberg, another theorist, developed a stage model of moral development. And he says in middle childhood or elementary school, children are aware of distributed justice. And what that means is it might differ depending on the person or the situation. And so here's more on Piaget's moral development view. And he says ages 5 to 6, children are in a stage of what he calls moral realism. And from their perspective, then, rules are absolute, and it doesn't matter why an individual does something or the circumstances, but the rules should be strictly enforced. 8 and above, though, they are in a stage of moral relativism, which means that a group can agree to change the rules, and punishment severity should be based on intentions and damage done. And at that stage, children realize that they're only going to get punished if they get caught breaking the rules. And so that belief in supreme authority no longer exists. So this next section has to do with peer acceptance. And this is often called sociometrics. And sociometric ratings are used to measure peer acceptance or rejection. And there are 4 categories. There's popular, rejected, controversial, and neglected. And a popular child is more likely to be liked by their peers and may be very social, or they could be antisocial. They could be popular because they're powerful and children respect power. There's the rejected group that's disliked by their peers for a variety of reasons. Maybe because they're aggressive, maybe because of physical characteristics or abilities. And then there's the controversial children that are liked by some and disliked by others. And then the neglected children that are not noticed, they're not liked, or they're not disliked. And so you might wonder how they came up with these categories. Well, they did this actually with elementary school children in school situations, and they asked them to categorize pictures of their friends in their classmates and put them in groups whether they like or dislike them. And they did this for a while to come up with these ideas, but then they noticed that it was affecting how the children interacted together, so they stopped doing these kinds of ratings. So what did they find were some of the characteristics of the kids that were in the popular category or the most liked? Those popular kids tend to maintain positive relationships and negotiate and compromise to resolve conflicts. And they were perceived to have higher social competency and social efficacy. They were more effective in their social interactions. And the parents of those children also influenced their peer acceptance. They tended to have more secure attachments to their parents and have more positive interactions. They guide parents with children who were in the more popular category, guided their children's peer interactions and were good gatekeepers. And then they use warm control and positive communication with their child. For the kids that are rejected by their peers, they tend to have internalized problems, like they may be depressed. They have low self-esteem or loneliness. They may have difficulties with academics and psychosocial adjustments. So then looking at other social contexts outside of the family, middle childhood or elementary school is the period when true and lasting friendships start to form, and these friendships can last clear into adulthood and sometimes all through adulthood. Gender segregation intensifies. They tend to prefer to interact and have more friends from their own gender. Girls report more intimate relationships, but girls tend to engage in relational aggression. This is an indirect form of aggression involving gossiping, spreading rumors, or excluding a child from a group in an effort to damage their social relationships. And in elementary school or middle childhood, friendships tend to be based on similarities. So let's look at the antisocial aspect of moral behavior. An aggressive or antisocial behavior is intended to hurt people or damage equipment or materials or furniture. Those that tend to have that type of behavior may become increasingly hostile and may become more person-directed in elementary school as opposed to earlier. If this is not addressed in elementary school, it could predict aggression and violence later in life. So earlier we said girls are more relationally aggressive. Boys tend to be more physically aggressive. Some contributing factors to antisocial moral behavior is low in perspective taking. So they tend to be behind in seeing other people's point of view, less effective at moral reasoning and self-control. If they come from a family that is aggressive or their parents are aggressive, they're following that role model. If they participate in media violence and they have no mediation by adults talking with them about that, they may see that as something that's positive. And then ecological or sociocultural conditions where they see others behaving in antisocial ways and becoming powerful or being rewarded for that behavior. And so that leads to talking about bullying. And there are 3 types of victims of bullies. There's the passive, the provocative, and the bully victims. So let's talk about the first one. The passive victim tends to be anxious, tends to have low self-esteem, and be physically weak. The provocative victim tends to draw negative attention and even elicit and engage in incidents where they may become victims. And then bully victims tend to provoke bullying in others and initiate aggressive acts. And so the effects of being a victim of a bully range from distrust and anxiety to extreme emotional issues as a result of that. So not only victims are affected by bullying behavior, but bystanders are too, and these are people who watch the bullying happening. And bystanders seldom do they intervene. Boys tend to intervene more than girls. Bystanders watching may encourage bullies and may even verbally encourage them or may start joining in with the bullying behavior. They may just witness and even join in because they might feel like they'll become a victim if they don't, and maybe become anxious in regards to that as a bystander. So most bullying involves verbal attacks. Most bullies have average self-esteem and social competence. Bullies have different moral standards, and we talked about that a couple of slides ago. Also, we already talked about that bullies tend to come from families where aggressive behavior is tolerated and sometimes reinforced. Most victims are shy, anxious, and rejected, and victimization is associated with long-term problems